Uh, I'm Connie Benita Dow, Dean of Libraries, and it's a real pleasure to welcome all of you here this evening. I know we have some special guests that have traveled a long way, and you're especially welcome tonight. This room has hosted only a few events to date, and when we here in the library envisioned a space like this, it was for this very purpose. It was to bring the community and our students and our faculty, our alums all together, and that's exactly what is happening tonight. I hope most of you have had a chance to look at the exhibits. We have a wonderful exhibit that'll be up through most of the summer called the 60s at 50, and it showcases some of our rare and special collections and also a few borrowed special items. And so appropriately, I think, tonight, the group we have here fits right into the theme of the 60s. There's a couple of cases on the civil rights movement at the far end of the lobby. I hope before you leave you get a chance to see those. I'm very proud to tell you that all the people speaking here in this row tonight are all alums of the same institution. Some of us more recently than others perhaps, but all of us are very proud Vanderbilt alums. I have the honor of introducing three alumni authors that are so distinguished. They're what we hope for all our graduates. They have gone on to do absolutely wonderful things. Oh, you have to be tortured much longer than this. Alex Heard, who earned his bachelor's in English in 1980, moved to Washington, D.C. afterwards, and he began working on magazines, and he's editorial director of Outside magazine, and he's also worked as editor and writer for Wired. I still have a Wired subscription at home. New York Times Magazine, the Washington Post, New Republic, and other publications. So he is a prolific contributor to those magazines. His most recent book, The Eyes of Willie McGhee, is a case study of the life of a young black man from Mississippi who in 1945 was sentenced to death for allegedly raping Willette Hawkins, a white housewife. The story that he tells in his book is an exhaustive documentary that required tremendous research in transcripts from courts, contemporary newspapers, archives, and all those things that libraries specialize in. We are honored to have him here tonight, along with two of his buddies. Charles Euchner, who majored in political science and graduated from Vanderbilt in 1982, went on to earn a master's degree and a doctorate from Johns Hopkins University. He's taught at Yale and the University of Pennsylvania. He served as executive director of the Rappaport Institute for Greater Boston at Harvard University. It's John Kennedy School of Government. And before becoming an academic, he was a staff writer for Education Week. His newest book, Nobody Turned Me Around, is an intimate account of the 1963 March on Washington, based on more than 100 interviews, thousands of pages of archival materials. Nobody Turned Me Around offers the only complete study of the moment when all factions of the civil rights movement gathered in one place, a day that was capped by Martin Luther King's amazing oratory. Our third author is Eric Etheridge, who majored in English and was a student journalist here at Vanderbilt before graduating in 1979. He worked as an editor for The Nation, Rolling Stone, Harper's, among other publications, and he's currently a photographer in New York. He's the author and photographer of Breach of Peace, Portraits of the 1961 Mississippi Freedom Riders. The book features 40-year-old mugshots from the 300 arrested riders in Jackson, Mississippi, as well as new portraits and excerpts of interviews with 80 of those riders Etheridge tracked down through his exhaustive research. See a theme here? Research is really important. And tonight, all three of them are going to talk with you about their books and the civil rights movement. I also have a special honor tonight to introduce John Seigenthaler. We know him as an award-winning journalist and editor emeritus of the Tennessean, chairman emeritus of the Tennessean, as well as one of the founders of USA Today. But tonight he brings to the table special experience in this particular arena. He left Nashville in the 60s and served at the Justice Department, and he was sent as the chief negotiator with the governor of Alabama during the Freedom Rides. And during the crisis, you know, I forgot to tell you, he's also a celebrity with Wikipedia. And during the crisis, while attempting to aid the Freedom Riders, one particular one especially, who were being attacked, he was attacked and hospitalized. And in the library's exhibit, there's a wonderful, he's loaned us this wonderful plaque that the centerpiece of that is a lead pipe, a plumbing pipe. And the inscription says, this is from Robert Kennedy, written in 1962. In recognition of his knighting for using his head in conflict, and as a symbol of the pipeline he always will have to his many old friends in Montgomery, Alabama. And it's dated March 26, 1962. I hope you'll take a moment to see that in the cases tonight. I know it's precious to John, but it's a wonderful symbol of someone that all of us, I think, are so proud of on so many different levels, and it's such an honor to have him moderating for us tonight. John?
Thank you, Connie. Dean, it's a great pleasure for me to be here and an honor to be with these three authors whose books take us back to a time that is difficult to remember and sometimes painful to think about. I spent a wonderful half hour on television with the three of them earlier this afternoon, and so I know all the answers to my questions, but they're an interesting group of authors. And the first question on my mind, of course, was what was in the water at Vanderbilt during their time here that produced three distinguished, well-reviewed books about the civil rights era. Alex takes the case of Willie McGhee, as Dean Dowler's just told you. Famous case, sadly forgotten, and he brings again to life what tragedy there was in this society during that period prior to the development of the movement, a time of lynch law justice, I think it's fair to say, Alex. And Charles, of course, has taken the Dream speech and Martin Luther King delivered there, as you'll remember, during the March on Washington, 1963. He gives you insights to it you can't get anywhere else. I was very close to everything that happened that week and that day, and I'll tell you again and again, as I read the book, it gave me new information and new insights, and it reminded me of that time in which the President of the United States was really distressed because he was afraid Washington was going to explode with 250,000 freedom fighters who had come nonviolently to Washington. And finally, we're 50 years ago next month that the Freedom Riders launched that trip that won me an iron pipe, but more than that, it won the attention of the nation as first a young group of Nashvillians following the first freedom rides, which ended in chaos in Birmingham and Anniston, Alabama, one Sunday afternoon, hospitalized most of that wave of freedom riders. Then the young children came down from Nashville to take it up and were jailed. And everyone thought it's over, you know. The result was that more than 300 flooded into the South from all over the country, many of them in jail, some in Parchman prison. And I just wondered what there was, what the dynamic was that brought these three graduates of Vanderbilt, whose time here intersected and overlapped. What was it that brought them all back to that period? And I discovered this afternoon, and I'll let them say it for themselves. Well, say it, Alex.
Well, partly it was a coincidence, but we were all, interested in that subject matter and gravitated toward it. But one of the common denominator for us is just having a chance to go to school here, great educational opportunities, but then as is true still, the opportunities for practical practice in journalism were very good. We had a good newspaper and a student magazine that were well funded, and we were given a lot of freedom to do some good stuff and some terrible stuff, but it all was a part of learning. And so I think that, I know in all of our cases, that was very important. And Charlie, I think you'd mentioned earlier that there was we had a figure here who was very important to us all.
Well, Jim Leeson was the consultant journalist for Vanderbilt Student Communication, which meant that he was supposed to be in 2 days a week, and he often was in 3 and 4 and 5 days a week. And he had no kind of everyday guidance over anything we did. And in fact, if he wanted to tell us what to do, that was the quickest way for us to get full of ourselves and tell him off. But he was a figure who was always around and who always took incredible interest in us. And the most important thing to me, Eric and Alex are both from Jackson, Mississippi. I was born in Tennessee, but I was raised in the North. And the issue of race, whenever it came up and whenever there was a simple answer and a kind of glib summary of something, Jim had a way of making it complicated again. And if there's any issue that's complicated, it's the issue of race in America. And so I think I learned, I came here as a 17-year-old, wet behind the ears, pretty naive kid. And Jim had a way of kind of explaining that things are complicated and that's a good thing, and that there's always a layer underneath what you think you understand. And I think all of us with all of our books, and I want to pass it on to Eric, we were trying to look for the story that had been kind of not covered up but glossed over because everybody thinks they know the answer before they learn much about the subject. And I think that's something that Jim taught us all. And we all stayed in touch, very close touch with Jim until his death a year ago. But you might want to say something else.
It had nothing to do with Leeson. No. I endorse what you both said, and especially what Alex said, just about the setup at the time when we were here with VSC and having the student media not be a part of any academic process. It was it changed, getting involved in that has really led me on the path that I'm still on of making media in different forms. It was a great setup. And Leeson was he was our mentor, and he taught us in very many different ways, none of which really would be recognized in a classroom. But I think for Alex and me, the story of race is part of who we are and how we grew up, and it was probably always back there in the background somehow. As we went off and did our young man's work, it was always sort of there waiting for us when we got a little older and wanted to sort of do our own projects and sort of investigate our own stories.
When you began the book, you are a photographer. Basically, it's a visual book. I mean, you provided
It's a picture book.
very eloquent text to support it, but the dramatic impact of those photographs.
Well, I was looking for, I had seen some projects where people had worked with historical photos, and I thought they were very successful. And also from the kind of, you know, and also very easy because the picture's already been made. So you just have to sort of, you know, find them and present them. And I knew, one day I'd sort of flashed on the Sovereignty Commission, which was a state agency in Mississippi that was started in '56, 2 years after Brown versus Board, and basically charged with doing anything and everything possible necessary to prevent change in Mississippi, to thwart the federal government, as we had been since Reconstruction, from doing anything to change segregation. And the files of that agency had been made public after a long lawsuit in 1998. And one year in 2003, I was home for Christmas and just kind of flashed on it and went looking in there for pictures I could do something with. And when I found the mugshots, I realized that, and realized what they were. It was a complete set of every writer arrested in Jackson in '61. There's 329 people. That, you know, here was this marvelous visual record of each individual. And the mugshots are, you know, some of them are not really great pictures, but some of them are really amazing portraits. And the people are really engaged and looking at, right at the camera, not what the photographer probably had in mind, but between the camera and this freedom writer, there's this really, you know, there's this person there ready to look right back at you and really engage you. And so I just wanted to get those pictures out there into the world, and I wanted to sort of see the writers again today, or find them and make a new portrait to go with that one. And you know, it's a way to sort of, Ray Arsenault, of course, has written a great book on the freedom rides, a classic academic narrative, which is very good. But I think the mugshots allow us to come into history at this sort of secular individual level, not the famous person, but the people like us, the regular person who, for whatever reason, because they'd been raised to be engaged, or because it was something they saw the pictures from Anniston and Montgomery and Birmingham and Life magazine and on the evening news, and just said, this cannot be my country. And they just got on the bus or got on the plane and went south. So it's a different way of telling history that I think really resonates, because everybody can.
You know, as I look at it again and again, I'm reminded of that dichotomy of then and now. We've all seen those ads in the slick magazines about before I went on the dot and afterward. But remarkable images. There are some of those people I would never recognize, given what age has done to them, and I'm sure they'd have the same problem with me.
Well, we'll find out in May.
Yeah, we will, that's for sure. May is the anniversary. Charles, as we think back on that time, I'm reminded of how difficult it is to recreate an environment that adequately depicts just how violent the society was, just how racist it was, how particularly across the South, there was no real sense of justice. Your book ultimately is a classic case of that. But the other side of it is, we see King's speech again and again and again, I have a dream, and we think we know it. The story of how he got to make it, right, is what you deal with. And this a man that I doubt many people in this room ever heard of, named Bayard Rustin. Mm. And Bayard Rustin was the organizer of the march, was the effective operator of the march. He planned it. He took care of all the details. And one of the things we forget in looking back is just how our society was nervous about three things he was.
Yeah,
One, he was gay.
right.
Two, he was a conscientious objector
In World War II,
in World War II. And three, he was a former communist.
right.
And I just wondered, I mean, you gave him due credit for everything he did. I mean,
Yeah.
in a sense, he's the hero of the book.
I think he is, yeah.
But talk a little bit about from Rustin
Well,
to
you know-
King, because I think that train is really important to the time.
Yeah, you know, I think there, Eric and I were talking about this earlier today, and I think that one of the things that was most fascinating to me, and it's just maybe not pure luck, but pretty close to it, is that the three most significant figures at the March on Washington were, I believe, also the three most significant figures in the civil rights movement for the previous 50 years, or the previous 40 years, the previous generation anyway. And they were A. Philip Randolph, who organized the first black labor union. He organized the sleeping car porters for the Pullman Company. And that was an 8-year struggle. And I think what Randolph gave the movement was the idea that to get change, you have to get out on the street. You have to use your bodies. You have to physically change yourself. Randolph said that the reason he wanted to put on these marches is that he wanted blacks to throw off their slave mentality. And the only way to do it is to get out there and speak with your own voice. And then one of his proteges was Bayard Rustin, who was, I believe, the leading thinker and practitioner of nonviolence in at least the 20th century, at least in the civil rights movement. And Rustin grew up outside Philadelphia, a Quaker, who had it deep in his bones that the only way that change was possible was through nonviolence, which doesn't mean turn the other cheek. It means to engage the other side, to withdraw consent from the regime and force them to justify themselves. And I believe that is why the civil rights movement was as effective as it was. And in fact, one of the people he taught this, who already understood it on a level but didn't understand it in as deep a way as was necessary, one of the people he taught was none other than a 26-year-old minister in Montgomery, Alabama, named Martin Luther King. And what I think King gave the movement was soul force. That was the term he used. And you know, his speech at the March on Washington is known for 4 words: I have a dream. But I believe the most important 4 words in that speech and in that year, and I think probably in that movement, is when at the very middle of the speech he said, unearned suffering is redemptive. And what he was trying to do, he was speaking to his people with a directness and an honesty that I believe is really rare in American politics or politics anywhere. He was saying, look, this is not going to be easy. There's been a lot of suffering, and there's going to be a whole lot more suffering because people do not voluntarily give up privilege. And so you have to be willing to suffer. But the reward of suffering is redemption, not just for yourself, but for other people as well. And so you have these 3 figures who bring body, mind, and soul to the movement. And they transformed this country over decades, and they also made the march happen. And that's why it, to me, was such a revealing moment of the civil rights movement.
Alex, Willie McGhee is of another generation.
Mm-hmm.
He's dead before the movement begins. A victim of lynch law justice, charged with the rape of a white woman in her home at night. She's sleeping with her child. All of a sudden, the South is locked into a great furor, a great turmoil, because we've got to defend white womanhood, and Willette, she pushed it, and when I think about Willie McGhee, I think about that term lynch law justice. In my view, he had no chance from the outset. It was inevitable that he'd be convicted, but the process of it, once again, Communist Party comes in and vies with the NAACP, who's going to represent him? And he takes the first offer that comes his way.
Right.
And in doing that, I think, didn't help his case. If anything, being affiliated with the communists damaged his case.
Well, he would have died. Let me just back up a little too. I don't think most people know you started to summarize it pretty well, but just to give you a little more, the Willie McGhee case started in 1945, and he was arrested and charged with raping this white housewife named Willette Hawkins. It happened in Laurel, Mississippi, and the case was obscure for the first 3 or so years that it played out. It ended in 1951 after 3 trials and multiple appeals to the U.S. Supreme Court. And his story ultimately was that he had had sex with this woman who was accused of raping. But he said that in fact it was consensual, that they'd had an affair that she started, and that she ratted him out when they were discovered. Now that claim may or may not be true, but that's what he said. She said he had raped her, and that was the essential struggle. One thing that was different about this case is it became famous over a period of years, and that was partly through the legal and propaganda effort of the group that had arranged his defense, which was the Communist Party of the U.S. Unlike later, the Communist Party in between 46 and 56 had an arm, a civil rights legal action arm called the Civil Rights Congress. And they vied with the NAACP to take control of these kinds of cases because they popped up all over the place in the 40s and 50s of an African-American male usually accused of rape or murder. And if he escaped lynching, he got what was called justice that was so one-sided that gave rise to the term legal lynching. So that's what was going on in the McGhee case. And the Communist Party out of New York heard about the case after his first trial, and then quietly, he was found guilty in a very quick proceeding that only lasted half a day. So then quietly behind the scenes, they arranged for an appeal, and then there were 2 more trials, and they had paid for the lawyers in those cases. So they ran it, and then in 1950 and 51, the case became famous. They put a lot of energy into making it a cause that attracted people on the left and the far left, particularly Communist Party members, but also people who had supported Henry Wallace, the Progressive Party candidate in 1948 against Truman. So it became this cause, and the more noise there was about it, the more distortion there was about what had really happened. And as he said, the Communist Party ran it, and that caused as many problems as it may have helped him, because it was in the height of the Cold War. So many people who might have supported the defense of somebody like this were turned off because the Communist Party was so radioactive then that they didn't want anything to do with it.
You talk about Jim Leeson, and the Willie McGhee case was a legal process. He had a deep interest in it.
Yeah, I mean,
and he exposed all of you to the Willie McGhee case.
You know, just to say real quickly, the case ended in 1951 with basically a public execution. Mississippi had a traveling electric chair at that time. So if you were executed, and this happened to white defendants too, they took the chair to the courthouse where you were convicted and set it up right in the courtroom in front of the judge's bench or the jury box, ran lines out the window down to a big generator truck, and the execution happened with witnesses in the courtroom, and if they so chose, a public crowd outside the courtroom who were there to just either celebrate or witness what was going on. And our friend Jim Leeson was 20 years old the night of the Willie McGhee execution on May 8th, 1951. He was a student at Southern, and he was a young journalist and a very avid hobbyist. He had his own darkroom, and he had a reel-to-reel tape recorder. And this execution was a big news event all over the world by the time it ended. So there was a little radio news team on the scene, and there was a broadcast. They were describing the scene outside the courtroom, and Jim just said, "This is important." And he turned on his tape recorder, and recorded the broadcast. And it's the only reason that any audio from the case survived, that he thought to do that. And he used to play that tape for us and other students just as an interesting thing to talk about and just to remind us how much things had changed since he was 20 years old.
And to remind all of us, I think, what the three of you took away from Vanderbilt that stayed with you. When we think about the King's speech, we think of I Have a Dream. We think of that that staccato cadence, I have a dream, I have a dream. They go over to the White House when it's over. President Kennedy comes in, first words out of his mouth, I have a dream.
Right.
But there were two advisors of Martin King, two young men, Wyatt T. Walker and Andy Young, both quite well known later on. The last thing in the world they wanted to hear was, I have a dream. You want to talk a little bit about
Well, you know, there's this legend that has developed about that line in the speech. The text of the speech that was distributed to reporters did not include that line. And the legend that's grown, and some people still push it despite all evidence to the contrary, the legend is that Mahalia Jackson, the great gospel singer, shouted out, Martin, tell him about the dream. And she actually did shout it out. That's not false. But Martin said he never heard it. And in any event, it wasn't spontaneous. They had been debating the night before, Wyatt T. Walker, Andy Young, and Martin Luther King, whether to put it in. And Wyatt and Andy said, whatever you do, don't talk about the dream. It's trite, it's cliche, it's boring, heard it before. He had just given it and used a version of this in Detroit a few weeks before, and several people around the movement were, talking about a dream. The dream is a powerful motif. And so King kind of sat there and listened to him and nodded the way that he did, and then he went ahead and did what he wanted to do. Now, what I discovered, and I consider myself very lucky to have stumbled into this, is that what I discovered is that he decided that night. He didn't kind of keep it open into the next day. Because I talked to someone who had just been hired by King. I talked to his son, and this guy's name was Harry Boyd, and his son is Harry Boyd Jr. And Harry's hotel room was right next to King's hotel room. And he was sleeping on a sleeping bag on the floor in the hotel room, and he hears this booming voice really loudly shouting out, I have a dream, that one day, and so on. So this was King doing what King did, which is trusting his gut, trusting his own knowledge of audiences and his own sense of poetry. That year alone, he gave about 360 or 370 speeches or sermons. So he had a kind of rich set pieces, is what the ministers call it, that he would combine in different ways to create a speech for the moment. And he was determined to make this set speech because he wanted, the way that one person explained to me, and I never thought about it this way before, is that the dream motif is so powerful because you can't take a dream away. You can argue with facts, you can argue with opinions, but you can't argue with somebody's dream. And so if King is saying, I have a dream, damn it, right? Nobody can say, no, you don't.
Yeah.
If he says, I'm equal, someone can say, no, you don't. If someone says, we shall overcome, someone can say, no, you're not going to overcome. But you can't say, no, you don't have that dream. And so there's a special power that motif had. And I think that King understood that this was his one chance to speak to all of America. And in fact, this event, it was the first event of its kind to be covered live all day long by CBS. Roger Mudd was the anchor. And so he understood the power of this motif, and I think he was very deliberate. He knew he was going to use those words when he marched up to the platform.
And of course, the President of the United States and Attorney General of the United States are on pins and needles.
Absolutely.
They know that the Nazi Party with George Lincoln Rockwell is volunteering to help control the crowd.
Right.
They know that Klansmen are all over the place, and they know that 250,000 demonstrators are likely to provoke some sort of conflict that'll turn into a conflagration. And I thought about the book on the Freedom Riders as I read that, because what they worried about was exactly what happened during the Freedom Rides. I mean, they had hoped they could get through that first administration and not have something close to Central High School. And of course, the Freedom Riders, in May of the first year in office, gave them the shock they really didn't want to have. You want to talk a little bit about?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, the Freedom Riders told the White House what they were going to do, and I don't think anybody paid any attention to them. And I think at some point after Anniston and Birmingham kind of blew up, you know, the president said, I don't even know what is a Freedom Rider? And it quickly got their attention. Kennedy was about to go to Vienna. Again, as Charlie said, height of the Cold War. He was going to go have his first meeting with Khrushchev. He's young. Is he up to the task? And then on the front pages of newspapers, not only around the country but around the world, are these pictures of pictures that show that the democracy and freedom in this country were not exactly as advertised. And they did their best, including some of the people at this table, to try to, you know, contain the rides and try to get them to for a cooling off period. But the riders, they were young. You know, the 60s, I haven't looked at any of the exhibit, but I'm interested to look at it here. The 60s, to me, you know, is a really kind of a whole period. It starts in February the 1st, 1960, when the 4 college students go into the Woolworth in Greensboro, North Carolina, and start the sit-in movement. And you can, I think, go in a direct line from there through Mississippi and the Freedom Rides, eventually out to Berkeley, and free speech movement, and the anti-war movement, and the women's movement coming out of Freedom Summer. I mean, it's all of a piece, and it's all of these students, very different backgrounds, pushing forward and being ready, as John Lewis would say again and again, and King would say, freedom now. You know, not in a few months, not after we file a lawsuit through the NAACP. They were just ready to go, and there was really no, you know, the Freedom Rides are justly celebrated today and will be celebrated a lot over the next month. But it's important to remember that there was really no one on their side at the time. The New York Times editorialized against them, David Brinkley editorialized against them, the more conservative civil rights organizations were not in favor. The NAACP and the Urban League, they thought they should stop after the violence in Alabama. But the riders knew that, you know, it was not about necessarily where people sat in waiting rooms of bus stations. It was about, are we going to find a way to break the pattern, the 300-year pattern of violence being used to keep us in our place, and being willing to suffer those attacks and move forward. Unearned suffering,
Is
right?
redemptive.
Is redemptive. They were committed, and I just want to go on a bit more here. I'm very curious about Bayard Rustin, and he's a fascinating figure in the movement to me, and I think he probably is, as Charlie describes him, that most important person. But if he has any competition, it's somebody who's right here at Vanderbilt today. It's James Lawson. And Lawson was another conscientious objector from World War II. He did a year in federal prison for withdrawing his selective service registration. He was the son and the grandson of ministers. He was raised very religiously. When he got to college, he was introduced through CORE and through Fellowship of Reconciliation to the idea of nonviolence. He took to it immediately. He went to India as a missionary and studied with some of Gandhi's people, and then he came back and he was in Oberlin, and he was going to saw King, and King said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, I'm going to go do some more study somewhere." And this was in the late 50s, and King said, "Come south, we need you now." And he ended up in Nashville, He ended up starting a study group at a church here to teach nonviolence. They're still kind of ticked off that those 4 kids in Greensboro beat them to the punch with the first sit-in, but it's true.
Yeah.
And but you know, they were soon, you know, fielding probably the most impressive student movement of the '60s right here, and Lawson remains a sort of a real, you know, the teacher of the beloved community, and these were his students: John Lewis, Bernard Lafayette, C.T. Vivian, James Bevel. Probably leaving out a couple more, but I mean, this became the, you know, a lot of the brain power of the movement over the next crucial 5 or 6 years, right here in Nashville, and right here at Vanderbilt. He was, among other things, a divinity student, but he was kicked out after sort of in the middle of the sit-in campaign.
You know, let me pitch in one thing, because you're talking about Lawson, and he's not only, you know, everything you said, but he's also this incredible gentleman. But what you were making me think when you were describing Lawson is this incredible blend of passion, I mean, passion like I've never experienced before, intelligence, and love. And it sounds corny, but it's true. And these things came together. And I'm reminded of this one interview that I found at the Nashville Public Library when I was doing my research. And James Bevel and Bernard Lafayette were being interviewed. It's a terrific interview. Go down and listen to it. And at one point, James Bevel is talking about being introduced to these ideas of nonviolence. And he said, you know, as I was thinking about this, I was realizing that this is like math. This is like geometry. And I'm good at geometry. I was always good at geometry in school. And it's like geometry this way. If you know how to do it and you do it, it works. Always. And so there was this kind of intense, you know, intellectual logic behind it. It's not just this Christ-like willingness to suffer, although it is that. But there's this incredible logic behind it, as well as the passion. And to me, virtually everybody I encountered had that combination of logic and passion. And they carried it with them wherever they go, and they were always refining it. They were always trying to think about, well, when am I getting too passionate? When am I getting too excited? Or when am I not passionate enough? Or when haven't I thought this thing through enough? They were really conscious of kind of developing a capacity, and this capacity grew dramatically over time. You know, every time out, they learned something which made them that much better next time out. And to me, it was that capacity to learn that really makes this so inspiring.
It should really be said that Vanderbilt in that time expelled him from mentoring those students who participated in the sit-ins. It also should be said that Vanderbilt of this time has created a chair in his name, has brought him back as a distinguished professor, and he helps in so many ways on his campus. He helps remind us of what that past was like. I'd like to ask the audience to consider some questions, and but I'd like to ask each of you to address one at a time the sort of research that it took to create your book. Each of you, I know, had to delve into the past and discover a past that was either never known or forgotten. And in each 3 books, I, who thought I knew everything there was to know about this time, suddenly I'm discovering facts about personalities I knew well, but it's an eye-opener to read each of these 3 books and discover that there are secrets relating to the movement that still are to be exposed. Alex, why don't your research involved Willie McGhee's family, and Well, you tell it.
Well, I started with that tape, and I didn't have much more than that, and then I just looked around to see what had been written. And there were a few pages here and there in books, but no book or anything really that made much sense. So it was a weird thing that happened. As famous as this case was, there wasn't a comprehensive and clear account of what had actually happened. So I just set out in two directions. I'm sure these guys did the same thing. Archival stuff on one hand, and making contact with living people on the other. So, and in my case, it involved court documents, a lot of the papers of the Civil Rights Congress, which are at a library in Harlem, and a lot of really interesting material that I got through Freedom of Information Act requests to the FBI, because the FBI paid a lot of attention to the case solely because it involved the Communist Party. They didn't care at all about McGhee and what happened to him, but because they were tracking the case and various individuals, including one of his attorneys, Bella Abzug, who worked on it because they suspected them of being Reds. There's a huge amount of information, and their gathering and reports tell me things about the case that would have been lost otherwise. So in a strange way, even though they were snooping based on political motives, the information they gathered was invaluable. The other thing I did, I just made a list that kept growing of every character in the story, and there were, literally hundreds of people who pop up, from his first defense attorney to Albert Einstein, who spoke out about the case towards the end in support of McGhee.
And Faulkner.
Yeah, and Faulkner got into it, and I tried to find, in all cases, if a relative, sons, daughters, or surviving spouse of the main characters in the case, to see if they knew anything that might shed light on it. And that ended up being very important because there's a lot of mysteries and mixed up information at the heart of this, and I was able to sort quite a bit of that out. So, but yeah, archives and interviewing, that's the main thing.
Let me ask you one question, and this will take some explication on your part. What do you make of his, quote, wife, close quote?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I will need to explain. Willie McGhee was arrested in 1945 and never got out of jail again. He had 4 kids. He was a laborer from Laurel, Mississippi, and he was married to a woman named Eliza Jane Payton. And he had actually I found all this out, no one knew this before, but he had left his family in 1942, 3 years before he was arrested, and then his wife divorced him. But when the case became famous, there was another woman on the scene named Rosalie McGhee, and she's all over the coverage at the time, who said that she was his wife and the mother of his 4 kids. And one of my first interviews back several years ago when I started this was with Willie McGhee's one surviving daughter and one of his granddaughters who live in Las Vegas. And when I walked in the door of their home, the first thing they did was say, there's this woman associated with the case named Rosalie McGhee who's supposedly my mother. Well, she's lying. We don't know who she was. And they had pictures of their real mother, and it was all very clear they were telling the truth. So they said, we've been trying to figure out for years who she was and why she was doing that. And that was the hardest, of all the things I've ever investigated, that was the hardest to figure out, because basically she was posing as his wife as a favor to him. She had met him through the bars of the jail he was in while she was visiting a cousin who was also incarcerated. And I think she came to have feelings for him during those visits, and she, with the Civil Rights Congress at their behest, she agreed to play the role of his wife and the mother of these kids he had so that he would look like a family man. They tried to burnish his image. They said he was a war veteran, and he wasn't. They said he was a dedicated family man, and he wasn't really that either, unfortunately. So it was really hard because Rosalie McGhee was an alias, and the FBI was confused about it too. I ended up finding out more about it than they ever did. But I found out she came from a different part of the state. Her name was Rosalie Saffold. She met him in jail. She spent 2 or 3 years as a major public figure in the case, because the Civil Rights Congress brought her up to New York. She did speaking engagements all over the country when they were trying to rally support for this. And I was able to finally discover that she, after the case ended, she moved out of Mississippi to Brooklyn, New York, and died there in the 60s. And I just recently heard from someone who read the book and called me because he knew her when he was a teenager. And I'm actually going to meet him next week during a trip to New York.
So the research goes on.
Yeah.
And Charles, how about research?
Well, all this stuff, you know, you call whoever you think might be alive, and you dive into the archives. One of the things that I did was the March on Washington Committee put all of its stuff in an archive, so it was all available to me. And one of the things that I did was I went through all the records of people who signed up to take a bus from Louisville or Nashville or Philadelphia or wherever. And I tried to, it was ridiculous trying to track all these people down. Most of them are dead, and all the women have changed their names, and you know, so it's hard to do, but I thought it was really worthwhile because I wanted to find people that nobody else had found before and nobody else had discovered. And I found quite a few people that way. And so I would call them up and I would say, you know, you took the bus from Detroit, remember? And they would, you know, it would take them a while, but they would remember, and they'd call back, or I'd go visit them, or whatever. And to me, one of the most exciting parts about this research was filling in the gaps of the records that were there. And I'll give you one example. I'll give you two examples, real quickies. One was I got a hold of live radio coverage of this event, and so I transcribed the whole thing, every word that was said on the radio that day. And one of the things that I found really fascinating was they interviewed this guy named Simon Clunan, who was just an ordinary working class guy from Maryland, and he happened to show up at the mall. And he was this guy who I thought, he was the everyman of 1963. He had sympathy for the demonstrators and for civil rights, and he said, well, why shouldn't they be able to have the same thing? But then he would turn around and say, but I don't know about this march, it's all communists. Mm. And the interviewer would say, well, what do you mean? How can you tell? And he said, well, you can tell just by looking at them. And then the interviewer would say, well, hold on a second. And he said, like, see that girl over there? She's with a colored boy. You know, why would she, you know? And so he would say these things that were patently ignorant, but then he would turn around and talk about how, you know, it is an absolute crime that we are not treating black people with the respect they deserve, and what we really need is job training and a guaranteed job. And it was, you know, dizzying trying to keep up with him, but he was everyman, you know. We were confused about these issues. They were really hard to sort through. And so I went crazy trying to track down Simon Clunan and his family. And I never did get him. But I was in Nashville, and I went to visit John Edgerton. He's not here, is he? Okay. But I went to visit John, and he spent about 2 or 3 hours talking to me about writing and storytelling and making good scenes and everything. And I told him about my dilemma with Simon Clunan. And he said, stop trying to do this. You've got enough right now, because the people who were listening didn't know who he was. That was just the voice on the radio to them, and that's what's important. And so, you know, he was right. And I think if I had found the family, I probably would have complicated a really poignant moment by talking about a whole bunch of stuff that didn't matter. But let me tell you about one story that I didn't get. I found a lot of letters written to Bayard Rustin. Dear Mr. Rustin, I want to volunteer for the march. One of them was from a guy named Patrick Cusick. And electricity went through me when I saw this record, because I knew Patrick Cusick. He was a community organizer in Boston, where I used to live. And I got to know him, and he was one of the nicest people I've ever known. He was the son of the head Klansman in Alabama. And he started getting involved in civil rights, and his family disowned him. And from the age of 18, he never saw any of his family again. And in '63, he was a student at UNC, and he was organizing, and he wrote to Bayard Rustin saying, I want to help you. How many buses do you want me to bring from UNC? Sadly, Pat died before I discovered this letter, and I would have loved to figure out some way to get it in there, but it didn't fit the story. So there are so many really wonderful pieces that don't make it in, but nonetheless, it was worth every minute to try to track it down. I contacted old friends, and sorry, he never told me about that. Pat himself told me about his Klansmen in his family. But nonetheless, even though not a word of Pat's story made it in, it still informed me because it gave me a sense of the tensions and the sense of hope that existed side by side. And so you track stuff down, some of it you get, some of it you don't, and that's just part of the process.
You know, there'd been other books on the Freedom Rise before Ray's, but your research involved in many cases stories that go beyond what was on the record. I mean, you reveal what it's like inside Parchman Prison. Where's that come from?
Well, I mean, I want to echo something that Alex said. I mean, my book would not exist without the Sovereignty Commission doing what it thought it was supposed to be doing and what it, you know, protecting our way of life. But I don't know what the mechanism was. I'm sure there was easy cooperation between them and the police. But to take those mugshots and, like a good bureaucrat, put them in the file and put the file in the drawer and leave it there. And they had the mugshot, and then they had what I call basic arrest data: full name, date of birth, birth city, current address, as well as some, you know, height, weight, hair color. And so it was, you know, they made this great, you know, they went almost all the way to making this great sort of memorial to the Freedom Riders. I just came along and sort of did the last 10%. But you know, it was, they also clip the papers every day. So in the Sovereignty Commission files, every piece of page of which is online on its own URL, thanks to the good folks at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, who have the responsibility for maintaining the files and making them public. So kudos to them and as great librarians. But I could go and look at the Clarion Ledger from the day that, you know, the day after the riders got to town. Mixers arrived. I could see these photographs, which the Clarion Ledger doesn't have anymore and only exist, you know, in this bad kind of Xerox scan in the Sovereignty Commission. So a lot of great background information that way. And then, like Charlie and like Alex, just making these cold calls to people and saying, you were a freedom rider in 1961, right? And they would go, some people would say, yes. And what do you know, and I would explain my project, and they would say, when can you get here? Let's talk. Other people were more, why do you want to know? Who are you? What are you going to do with this? And I learned to say, I have your mugshot from 1961. Have you ever seen it? And they would say, no. Some people had. I mean, they weren't secret, and I didn't discover the mugshots. Some people knew they were there, but I could, you know, because most everybody has email. I could email it to them as soon as we talked on the phone for the first time, and that really got me in there. And so eventually I would go and see them, and I got to the point was to take the picture, of course, and in the beginning I didn't even record our conversations, but I quickly realized I needed to be doing that. And I got to enjoy that conversation part as much as making the picture, because I get their whole family story and where their families had come from and how they had been brought up and what led them to go to Mississippi and get arrested. And you know, it sort of became this fascinating, very pointillist portrait of the country, you know, from like post-war up to 61, and black families going to California looking for a better life, Eastern European immigrant families coming out of the stockyards in Chicago and right after the war hitting Route 66 and moving to California, and just all sorts of, you know, amazing family narratives that all then converge in this one like 6-month period in Mississippi. And everybody had a kind of a different story, and some people, you try to get parchment details and that part's gone from them. Other ones could talk, for hours about that. And it was a real I mean, I've always been an editor, and it was a real education for me in becoming a reporter, or becoming someone just to listen and try to, pull somebody's story out of them, and listen for what's important. And I would find myself a lot of times reading the transcripts many months later and seeing a whole angle that it just eluded me in the moment. And man, I wish I'd gone back and, look right there, there's this sort of little crack and they're opening up, and I didn't pursue it. Because part of the time I was also watching them and trying to find that natural pose that I think everybody has, so I could see how to arrange them when I took the photograph.
Anybody want to get into that? You sure do. Go ahead.
Tell us more about Jim Leeson's background before he came to Vanderbilt, because I think that has an archive.
Indeed it does. He was involved in race relations reporting early on, and there was the race relations reporter. It was a publication, and they had a staff here. First chairman was Pete McKnight from Charlotte, North Carolina, who was the editor over there. But you all would know,
I have
better than I. I think the one rule that governed Jim Leeson's life as a journalist was not just accuracy, but fairness and balance. Is that?
Yeah, well, I have a story about that, because it was a kind of a learning moment for me. This is years and years after graduation. A number of us met in New York City. Eric, you were there. And Jim was in town to go to museums. He was this cultural dynamo. He loved organ music and art and books and everything. And so we were there, and we were eating dinner one night, and someone said something about how biased newspaper reporting is these days. And I started making the stupid argument that the whole concept of impartiality and balance was kind of outdated, and that every reporter was biased, and why not at least just be honest about it. And Jim held the line. He wouldn't go along, and so we just kind of let it go at that. Now, previously, he had given me the bound volumes of the Southern School News and the Race Relations Reporter, and I had them in my apartment, and I got home and I started reading these things. And then I was reading how unbelievably detailed, thorough, balanced, fair, and empathic they were. And I thought, oh my God, he was right. And so I wrote him a letter, and I said, Leeson, about that business of impartiality and everything, you were right, I was wrong. Sorry about that. I just read your bound volumes, and they're amazing, and I just wish other people could see this stuff. And I don't know if he meant it or not, but he wrote back and he said, don't worry, Charlie, I think you got it all along. But that's the thing about a great teacher, is they teach you stuff in a way that you discover it for yourself.
Question?
John.
Jim.
Those of us who were reporters in the dark ages are envious of people now who have access to the aggregate data. You can, if I can't believe how good I would have been if I had. Did you have, to what degree did it help you do this?
I couldn't have done I guess I could have, but I'm finding all these people, since the Sovereignty Commission had their birth date and their full name, and so that plus the internet was just, that's how I found a lot of people. And I paid a little money. I used some fee-based search sites, but I don't know how I would have done it otherwise.
FOIA was helpful also.
Yeah.
The FBI gave me a couple really terrific scenes, because they would be in these black churches in the last pew taking these notes about what was going on, 2 days before the march. I have a great scene in there about a church meeting in Selma. And so I did a bunch of FOIA requests. Again, the yield was very small. You know, I got thousands and thousands of pages and, you know, only stuff worthwhile using in a couple of instances, but it was worth it because it was so priceless.
For those who don't know, FOIA is that Freedom of Information Act.
You know.
Yeah.
But in this, I think in all these though, there's still no substitute for what's in archives. And I think, I don't think you think this, but a lot of people think everything is available online. 90%.
No, I was wondering how much,
Yeah.
I mean,
90% of the things I used are on paper somewhere, and I or someone else had to go look them up. And so, I don't think that will ever change. The Mississippi Sovereignty Commission papers are online, but that's pretty rare. The NAACP papers, which are vast, are not. They're on
And
microfilm.
they're very badly
And a
cataloged.
huge collection at Tuskegee of what are called the lynching files. Those things are only on film, and I don't think they'll ever be. So it's always going to be necessary to do a little of everything.
Frank Sutherland.
You know, Frank Gibson was the best public records reporter in Tennessee I ever had. And he used to talk about doing that research first.
He's here, by the way,
Yes,
somewhere. There he
over
is.
there. And he talked about doing that and then doing the interviews. I'm curious about how you operated. Did you do your archival work first, and then did you operate with a BS meter in doing the interviews, or did you throw facts back at the people you interviewed? How did you go about resolving conflicts and pursue the truth and be fair and balanced at the same time?
Well, it's just the old standard rule that that you have to corroborate it somehow. There's a lot of stuff that didn't make it because I couldn't corroborate it or I couldn't believe it. And you know, if you can't find a living person, there's records all over the place, and you just here's one way that that I got really lucky. I went to the I can't remember what it's called, the Schaumburg Library in New York City.
Yeah, Schaumburg.
The Schaumburg branch, and this is about showing up as opposed to clicking away at your computer. I go up there, and this woman behind the counter gave me all kinds of stuff. She was a dream, and here's technology. I used my digital camera and I took pictures of every single page, and then I went home and I looked at the pictures, and the pictures were good enough that I could read the writing on them. So that meant I didn't have to spend forever and all this expense using a Xerox machine and worrying about messing up the files. But I remember I got into a conversation with the woman behind the counter, and she said, "Oh, it's too bad that the Golan files aren't available." And I said, "The what files?" And she said, "Alfred Golan. He's the only one who actually sent a group of researchers out there to interview people on the mall." And I said, "Nope." And she said, "Yeah, but it hasn't been cataloged." And I said, "Well, when's it going to be cataloged?" She said, "Oh, a few years, I expect." And I said, "Boy, it sure would be nice to have." And she just looked at me and she said, "You know what? If you keep it in the right order, I'll give you the boxes." And it was a gold mine. There wasn't anything that I directly used from it, but I got a lot of names, and then I could call up the people and track them down. But it's, you know, you really do have to get out of the house and show up and talk to the person behind the counter, you know, not to mention direct sources.
Another question. Yes.
It's kind of a broad question on race, but do you think class warfare is just as toxic today in terms of the struggle for racial equality as it was in the 60s?
I've got an answer. It's real quick. It's not nearly as toxic, not even close. But we don't have nearly as good people and as good ideas to help see us through. I shouldn't say as good people. We don't have the likes of Bayard Rustin, James Lawson, Martin Luther King, James Farmer, this long list of people.
And when we lose John Lewis, a year will pass.
I think that period was much tougher. It was vicious. It was vicious. But we had these amazing people, not just them, but the more anonymous types that Eric found and so many others. You know, the quality of commitment and the determination, I don't see it in anywhere near the measure that there was back in those days. I think that's the difference. but it was much tougher then, and we needed them much more then.
You had a follow-up?
Yeah, quick follow-up. Given that, I think, the prevailing attitude among much of white America is that the civil rights movement happened, and now we're all equal, we all have the same opportunities. Do you think the struggle for racial equality is that much harder now than it was then?
I think the easy battles are over, and the 60s were about really clear-cut cases of, if you're an American, you should be able to vote, right? Among other things. So now those things have been addressed, and I think the sense of a lot of the writers that I talk to is that who've all remained committed, and most of them in one way or another, to doing the kind of work they can do as older people, school teachers, or involved in campaigns or whatever, is that there's still work going to be done. I think it's not as clear cut. It's more complicated. It involves class as well as race. Reading more, doing my book sort of led me into reading much more Mississippi history than I had ever done before, and reading Nick Lemon's book recently on called Redemption, about Reconstruction in Mississippi. It has this really kind of strange effect on me. I think we're still living in the post-Reconstruction era, and the history of Mississippi, the political history of Mississippi since 1865 is the history of white hysteria, and I think that to me is the same reaction that the people in Yazoo or Vicksburg had to having black sheriff is the same reaction that a lot of people I see today have to Obama. It's unimaginable. So he must be an alien, and all this voter ID stuff. I mean, that's right out of that's right out of Reconstruction. I mean, it's still the same playbook.
Let me just add one anecdote. I guess it was a little over 2 years ago that Vanderbilt conducted a reenactment of the Freedom Rides, and there were 4 buses of largely students, some faculty. Out of that trip, Congressman Lewis, who was on the rides, remembered that there were 14 students at Tennessee State University who, on the Monday after they were jailed on Saturday at Jackson, Mississippi, were convicted in court, and that afternoon were expelled from Tennessee State. And John raised the question, is there not some way to get honorary degrees for these 14 courageous young colleagues of mine? And so an issue was made of it. And the Governor Bredesen indicated his support of it, and it went to the Tennessee Board of Regents. And the Board of Regents voted 7-4 against granting honorary degrees on the grounds that it might diminish the honor of the honorary degree. Now, that's 2 years ago. How easy we forget. And fortunately, a couple of the caucuses in the legislature talked to a couple of members of that Board of Regents and said, we'll give you 2 weeks to correct it before we condemn you. And they called an emergency telephone meeting and voted 11-0 in favor of granting honorary degrees. But we just have to remember, I want to say, Connie, what a great pleasure it has been to be here tonight with these 3 distinguished authors who mean so much to the letters that we love, and who represent Vanderbilt in a unique, and they say it was a coincidence, but I tell you, I think it was something in the water.
Well, they have graciously agreed to sign books for us for a few minutes, and wasn't this a pleasure? What a wonderful evening. Would you show your appreciation to
head back.
Okay.